What's up guys, how's it going? So this video is all about photography. A few years ago, we did an entire series on photography where I went over some photographic techniques as well as post-processing and then some more topical based videos after that. It occurred to me that that was much longer ago than I originally thought. So I figured it would be a good idea to kind of revisit the entire topic of photography, kind of still go over the basics, but then introduce some of the new things that we do here. If you haven't noticed, photo and video, it's kind of a big deal here at Tidal Gardens. We take it very seriously, and we go to great lengths to capture fantastic imagery. So in this video, we're going to cover a lot of what it takes to get really great photos. As a short personal aside, the whole photography and videography game was something that kind of sprung up out of this business, out of this hobby. Because back when I started Tidal Gardens, one of the things that I really wanted to show was just how beautiful these corals were. And this is a very aesthetic industry in general. So if you're not able to communicate that aesthetic to your audience, you're really kind of missing out, right? So that's when I totally went down this rabbit hole of trying to get much better video, much better photography in general. And over the years, I've started to train my staff. So for many, many years, my number one guy, Ben, was doing pretty much all of the photography while I focused more on video. And now that we've got Becca here, she's learning all of the kind of the tricks of the trade as far as just getting great coral imagery. So you'll hear her talk a lot more about the basics and the techniques that go into photography because essentially she's the one that's doing all of that now for us. And I can tell that both Ben and Becca have been doing a really good job because sometimes on social media I see, Than, you take like the best photos, and it's like, truth be known, I don't think I've actually shot a picture of a coral for years. It's pretty much these guys that have been carrying that torch. So anyway, let's get into it.
All right, guys, so to start this off, the first things you're going to want to know are the three main mechanics when dealing with photo and video. And those are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, what exactly are those things, you may be asking? Well, all of these actually have to deal with the light and how it enters the camera and the image you're creating. So a quick rundown of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO can be compared to an old radio and how they have a lot of noise sensitivity. So when you're turning up the radio's volume, you may hear a crackling, hissing sound. You get the same thing with ISO, but this is a sensitivity to light instead of sound. Instead of that hissing sound, you get grain introduced to your image. The more grain there is, the more detail is taken away from the image. When it comes to shooting with a DSLR camera, for still photography, between 100 and 800 is a good spot to be in. Between 800 and 1600 can be a bit iffy, and anything above 1600 you'll absolutely be seeing some obvious grain. Now take that as more of a broad suggestion instead of a definite answer, because ISO is actually dependent on what kind of camera you're using. If you're using a really high top dollar quality camera, your ISO will be a little bit more flexible with what it can do. You can turn up that ISO all the way up to 6400 and still get a little bit of grain, and that's great. But if you're using a camera that's kind of medium quality, beginner quality, you may want to shoot for the lower side of that spectrum because it's not going to be as great of quality in terms of ISO. Next is aperture, which is the camera equivalent to the pupil of your eyeball. You may have looked in the mirror at one point while turning the light switch on and off and noticed that your pupil gets bigger or smaller to take in more or less light. Cameras actually have the same thing, but you are able to control it. So if you want more light entering the camera, make the aperture bigger. And if you want less light, make the aperture smaller. You may have noticed that when I'm referring to bigger versus smaller apertures, there's numbers involved, and the numbers can kind of get confusing to some. So when I'm talking about bigger aperture, you may notice that the number is pretty small, like 2.8. And if I'm talking about a smaller aperture, the number is pretty big, like 11, 12, and so forth. That is because Aperture is viewed in terms of fractions. So if you're looking at half of a pie versus a fourth of a pie, 4 is bigger than 2, however, 1/2 is bigger than 1/4. So it's the same thing with aperture. So if you think about it in terms of pi, it might make more sense. Now, what's going to happen if your aperture is too big or too small? If your aperture is too small, this could result in a darker image. If your aperture is too big, there's a couple things that could actually happen. The first is the image will be really, really bright. And the second is you may notice parts of your image are out of focus when you don't want them to be. And that has to deal with depth of field. Depth of field measures how much of the image is actually in focus. The larger the aperture, the smaller the depth of field, meaning only a small portion of the whole image will actually be in focus. So when it comes to actually shooting corals, we tend to use a smaller aperture, such as f8 to f11, to get the whole coral in focus while getting a slightly blurry background to really make that coral pop. We then use a slower shutter speed to compensate for the smaller amount of light being taken in by the camera. And then speaking of shutter speed, that's the last thing on the list. So shutter speed is the amount of time the outside light has to hit the image, or in simpler terms, how long it actually takes for the camera to take the photo. So if you have a slower shutter speed, that gives the light more time to enter the camera, making the image a lot lighter. And vice versa, if you give the light less time to enter the camera, your image will be darker. Now, what will happen if the shutter speed is too high or too low? If it's too high, as discussed before, the image will be darker. If it's too low, the image will actually be lighter. But something else can happen to your coral images if your shutter speed is too low, and that is known as motion blur. Motion blur is what happens to your image if the subject or the camera moves while your photo is being taken. If the shutter speed is really low, this gives a larger window for this to happen, especially with the corals that like to move around quite a bit. So here's how we get around motion blur while using a lower shutter speed. If it's a subject that moves around quite a bit, like an elegance or a torch, we turn the flow completely off or lower it significantly to keep the coral from moving, and then quickly try to get a photo of the coral before it deflates completely. It's definitely something that needs a lot of practice if you want to try this at home. Another thing you can do to reduce motion blur, if it's the kind of motion blur that's caused by your camera moving, is just to get a tripod. Keeping a camera on a tripod makes sure the camera isn't moving while the photo is in progress. If you're taking handheld photos, you may think you're being really, really still, but in reality, your body's still moving enough to cause problems. With a tripod, you don't have to worry about that. A rule of thumb that most photographers follow is to never shoot handheld with a shutter speed lower than 1/60th of a second. However, I still enjoy shooting with a tripod regardless of the shutter speed I'm using to give me another layer of security that my photo is going to turn out really, really good. One thing about tripods is they are meant to last you a majority of your photography career, so investing in a higher quality tripod right off the bat is a much better option than replacing cheap tripods year after year. Cheap tripods also have a higher risk of failing while holding your camera, and the last thing that I want is my $5,000 worth of camera equipment tumbling to the ground and smashing into a million pieces. So get a higher quality tripod and you won't really have to worry about that too much. Alright, so we've gone over ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how they all work together to make the best image possible. But some of you may be wondering, why do I have to know all this? Doesn't the camera have preset modes for landscapes and portraits that I can use that'll do everything for me? Technically, yes. But please don't use them, and I have a good reason behind this. Preset modes give you little to no flexibility to change anything when taking photos, and that's crucial in coral photography. And also, there's no coral preset on cameras, so you have no excuse to be using presets. However, if you aren't comfortable shooting in full manual yet, that's okay. It can be a daunting task for anyone. And there's a setting on the camera that I compared to training wheels on a bike that might be able to help you out. This setting is called Aperture Value Mode, or AV mode for short. This setting still allows you to be able to change the aperture by yourself, and the camera will do everything else. This allows you to learn how aperture affects the camera without being overwhelmed with all the different settings, and you can switch to manual mode later on after you feel comfortable. In the end, I will always use manual mode myself because I've been doing this for years and years and years, and without that full control I have of my camera, I'll probably go insane. But obviously, if you don't have that experience and you're not ready for that yet, it's okay to use AV mode. That's perfectly fine. Okay, so we've talked a lot about photography. Now we're going to put that aside and talk about videography now. Lucky for you, videography uses the same holy trinity of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed that photography uses, and all of them work the same, except for one tiny difference. Shutter speed has to stay at a certain size the whole time. You can't really change it. When shooting video, you have what is called the frame rate. Most footage you see here at Tidal Gardens is shot at 60 frames per second, which means every second of video includes 60 distinct images that flow together. A more common frame rate is 30 frames per second. However, we like to use 60 frames per second because it makes the video look as sharp as possible. Now going back to why you can't change the shutter speed, this has to deal with the 180-degree shutter rule. Now, what is the 180-degree shutter rule, you may be asking at home? The 180-degree shutter rule essentially means the shutter speed you set your camera to should be twice the amount of the frames per second. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/120th of a second instead of 1/60th of a second. That's where shooting video gets tricky. It's not as flexible as photography because you aren't able to adjust the shutter speed to make up for light. It has to stay at a certain speed or else the video won't look right. Now on the topic of 60 frames per second versus 30 frames per second, a thing to keep in mind if you have the equipment to shoot in 60 frames per second is the fact that 60 frames per second uses twice as much light as 30 frames per second. So your footage will actually be a lot darker and require extra help with either in-camera mechanics or external lighting. This is because, remember when we talked about how the faster the shutter speed is, the less light is taken in? Well, video does the same thing, except the shutter is more kind of invisible because it's going all the time. So since each frame in 60 frames per second is receiving half as much light as the frames in 30 frames per second, they'll end up darker. So keep that in mind if you're trying to decide whether or not you want to be shooting in 60 frames per second, because on one hand, it's going to look a lot crisper than 30 frames per second, but on the other hand, you're going to need a lot more light to compensate for that 60 frames per second, and if you don't have that lighting, it might not be in your best interest. So, moving on to lighting, now that we're talking about that, how exactly do we do all of our lighting here at Tidal Gardens? Well, we use a lot of external lighting to get optimum coral photos. Here at Tidal Gardens, we use everything from ring lights to video lights to even a Kessler mounted on a tripod. We have it all. Like right now, I'm using a video light here and a ring light right here. But you came here to learn about coral photography and not me photography. And that's where the Kessler comes in. When it comes to shooting corals at the bottom of a tank, light can be pretty limited. So that's where we came up with the idea of lighting the corals from the front using a Kessler on a flexible arm. This gives us the ability to move the light around where we want it, as well as change the color temperature. Now, speaking of moving the light around, to achieve the desired natural look we're going for, we don't want to light the coral directly from the front. You'll get a deer in the headlights type of look, and that's not great. So what we like to do is light it from the top off to the side, making it look more natural. Now, one last bit of advice when dealing with lighting is the use of T5 lighting versus LED lighting. Our Kessler that we use is an LED light, which is nice, but LEDs can come off as a bit harsh, as well as hard to edit with. This is because the color spectrum of LEDs is very limited, so when you see the color blue in an LED light, that's all it is. Blue. Not a bunch of colors flowing together to get a blue look. And that can be a bit tricky to get rid of in the editing process. So ideally, we would like to find a way to mount a T5 light onto a tripod one day and use that instead, because it's a lot less harsh and more diffused, and also it's a little bit easier to edit with because T5 lights have a larger color spectrum in one light bulb. You may see white light, but that white light is a combination of a bunch of different colors all at once, and that makes for flexible editing and making my life as the photo editor a lot easier. But also keep in mind, you at home do not have to use the fancy schmancy lighting that we have here at Tidal Gardens. Here at Tidal Gardens, a lot of our business is derived from how well our photos look on our website, so we want to use better quality lighting. But if you're at home and just kind of doing this for yourself, you don't have to invest that much into lighting. That's just something that we do. If you want to do that, feel free. I'm not stopping you, but just know that it's not a requirement. It's just kind of more of a really good suggestion of what you do, but just, you don't have to spend as much money as we do on lighting for this. It's okay. Well, all right, guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the first installment of our updated photography and videography series. There will be more installments to come, so stay excited for those. And another thing to be excited about is there's new merch on the website, including, but not limited to, this adorable pocket t-shirt with a little coral inside. It's available in multiple styles, so there's something for everybody. And also, I'll let you in on a little secret that the website doesn't show. If you pull down this pocket here, there's a little face on it. So it's like you're carrying a little coral friend around with you all day long. So if you click the link down below, that will take you to our merch store where you can shop to your heart's content and hopefully pick out one of these little guys. So, like I said before, there will be more of these photography and videography videos on the way, so stay tuned for those. And until next time, happy reefing! Next. You're so funny.
To shoot both good video and good audio. Oh.
I'm fine. I'm fine. When you're turning up a radio's volume, you may hear a cackling. It's a witch. There's a witch in your radio. You should probably get that checked out.
If you haven't noticed,
when you're turning up a radio's volume, you may hear a cackling. I said it again! Why? I spent so much money on a communications degree, and I can't even talk right.